So I've been working at the SAFE project on dung beetles, which are a group of insects that feed primarily on mammal dung. And these guys are really important in terms of ecosystem functioning. So they're important in putting the nutrients back into the soil. They're also important as prey items for various birds, bats and mammals within the ecosystem. So quite an important group to study in terms of both their biodiversity and their ecosystem functioning. So we've been measuring dung beetle abundance, diversity and the composition of communities across the SAFE landscape, so from primary forest, in logged forests, both heavily logged forest and lightly logged forest, through to the oil palm plantations. And we've been doing these measurements since 2011, so pre-clearance, then in 2015 during the salvage logging, and then recently in 2018, so after the logging. And then as well as these measurements on the dung beetle community, we've also been measuring dung removal rates. So we put out a pile of dung in the forest and we come back after 24 hours and we look at how much dung has been removed within that time. And that gives us quite an accurate measurement of how much dung has been put back into the ecosystem. So one of the key things that we've been really interested in is the movement of nitrogen through the ecosystem. So one of our Lombok students, Tor Kemp, has been studying nitrogen flows through the system. So we set up some what we call mesocosms, so little arenas, and in those arenas we've put piles of dung with and without dung beetles. And we've been quite interested to see how much the dung beetles help in incorporating the nitrogen back into the system and how much this can be taken up by the plants in the system. Yeah, so dung beetles are really good, what we call biological indicators, because they're very closely linked to mammal populations. So basically, if you have quite a lot of mammals in your system, then you've probably got large populations of dung beetles. And although dung beetles are thought to be quite generalists, so they will feed on quite a lot of different dung sources, they might be more specialised for actually nesting and for breeding and for their larvae. So what we think is that also some dung beetle species will be particularly associated with particular mammal species. So camera trapping, which is the usual way of monitoring your mammal populations, is quite labour intensive. It's quite expensive in terms of you've got to buy all your camera traps. So dung beetles are kind of useful surrogates potentially for looking at mammal populations. And if you get certain dung beetle groups, that might mean that you've got certain mammal populations. And if you're missing certain groups of dung beetles, so for example those that are associated with primate populations, it might tell you that particular primates such as orangutans are at low densities within those areas. So this is something that we're working on at the moment. So we've been building quite complex networks between mammal communities and dung beetle communities by trapping with different dung types. So most people, when they trap for dung beetles, use either cattle dung or human dung in the dung-baited pitfall traps. But we've been trying to use dung collected from the animals that actually occur in the area, so we can build up these networks across the landscapes. We've also been overlaying our dung beetle data with the camera trap data collected by the camera trapping team, so Ollie Wern and Nick Deere and Matt Strubig's group, to enable us to look at the overlap between various mammal species and dung beetle species. So we've also been using dung beetles as a really good group to look at whether animals actually use riparian riparian buffer strips, so strips of trees that occur along the edges of rivers as corridors. So often in these oil palm landscapes what we have are fragments of forest that are connected up by corridors of forest, often along rivers, and there's very little evidence out there that animals actually use these corridors or use these strips of forest as corridors. So what we've been able to do with the dung beetles is that you mark them up using silver marker pens. You put dots on their wings, you capture them and you release them, and then you see where they move within the landscape. And we found some quite compelling evidence that the dung beetles have actually been using these strips of forest as corridors to move up and down the landscape. And only the very sort of generalist species, so those ones particularly associated with oil palm, will move out into the oil palm landscapes. Yeah, so the forests running along rivers are potentially very important because they might act as corridors for animals to move across the landscape. So increasingly what we see in oil palm landscapes is that we have fragments of forest scattered throughout that landscape with very little connectivity between them. And so these forest strips potentially then allow animals to move through the landscape and to recolonise other patches of forest.